which completely shatters how we usually approach this kind of text, right? I mean, if you sit down and read Allama Parwaz's analysis of Surah Fusilat, specifically verses 33 through 40, you realize he is entirely discarding the mystical lens that people normally use.
Oh, absolutely. He just completely tosses it out.
Yeah, he argues that when the text talks about the, quote, descent of angels, it is absolutely not describing, winged beings appearing in a vision, or like some warm spiritual feeling of peace you get while meditating in a quiet room.
Right. It's not an ethereal internal vibe at all.
Exactly. He interprets it as a strictly socioeconomic structural reality that happens right here on the ground.
And that reframing, I mean, it changes the entire metric of how a society evaluates itself. You aren't measuring the descent of angels by looking up at the sky,
Right, or counting how many people are engaged in private rituals.
Exactly. You measure it by auditing the economy, you look at the social safety nets, you look at the tangible physical living conditions of the population. Parwaz is making the argument that a society that actually aligns its structural laws with divine principles, well, it achieves a state of absolute material abundance and psychological security.
Which is a massive claim.
It is, and the specific phrase used in the text is fi al-hayat al-dunya, meaning in this world, not the afterlife, here, now.
So the promise outlined there is essentially whatever you want, you get in this world, which I have to admit sounds almost utopian.
Sure, yeah, it sounds too good to be true.
And my immediate reaction when reading that was just skepticism. Like, how do we know if a society has actually achieved that? Because frankly, any political leader can stand at a podium and declare that their nation is blessed.
So they do it all the time.
Yeah. Or that their system is perfectly aligned with ultimate moral principles. They point to their ideological purity as proof of their success, even if, half their population is struggling to pay rent.
And that gap between ideological claims and reality is exactly what Parwaz targets. He introduces this brilliant empirical analogy from the text to just cut right through that kind of political or religious self-deception.
Okay, I love this part, the boiling water analogy.
Yes. It's the analogy of putting a pot of water on a fire. If you have a fire and you place a pot of water directly over it, the water boils. That is the necessary, unavoidable result of the structural relationship between the heat and the water.
Right. It's just physics.
Exactly. Now, if you are staring at that pot and the water isn't boiling, what is the logical conclusion?
Well, you don't try to convince yourself that the water is boiling in some invisible metaphorical sense. You conclude the fire isn't hot enough.
Or there's no fire at all.
Right. There is no fire.
Precisely. You don't get to claim the heat exists if the water isn't reacting. And Parwaz applies that strict empirical standard to the structure of a society. If a government or a social system claims to be governed by ultimate divine principles, but its citizens are impoverished,
then it's failing the test.
Totally. If they are terrified of systemic violence, if they are starving or drowning in medical debt, then the system is fundamentally broken. The fire isn't lit.
Wow. So the proof of the descent of angels, which in his framework is the realization of ultimate societal order and prosperity, is just in the tangible, worldly results.
Yes. If there is fear and unmet need, the system has failed the empirical test. There is zero room for a society to say, well, our economy is collapsing, but hey, our moral ideology is correct.
That is such a ruthless standard to hold a government to. I mean, it essentially means that political success or moral legitimacy cannot be measured by how passionately people debate on television.
No, never.
Or how fiercely they defend their historical traditions. It is measured purely by the complete eradication of fear and unmet material needs.
That's the baseline.
But here is where I struggle with this a bit, Setting the eradication of fear and hunger as the baseline metric sounds great in theory, but human societies are inherently messy.
Very messy, yeah.
So how does a system actually achieve that without becoming incredibly authoritarian? If the goal is absolute material abundance, doesn't that require a level of control that inherently breeds a different kind of fear?
And that is the pivotal question right there. It forces us to look at how Parwaz redefines the mechanics of social order. He argues that you don't achieve this state through authoritarian force because authoritarian force is inherently a symptom of a broken system.
Interesting. So the force itself is proof the water isn't boiling.
Exactly. If a society is failing the boiling water test, if it is struggling with crime and disorder, it means there's a profound structural imbalance. To fix that, Parwaz strips away the traditional theological gloss from concepts like good and evil, and he redefines them in a purely architectural, socioeconomic way.
Right? He translates the Quranic terms hasanat and sayat, which is fascinating because usually if you ask someone what those words mean, they'll say good deeds and sins.
Yeah, that's the standard translation.
They view them as an internal moral scorecard. Like if you help an old lady cross the street, you get a point for hasanat. If you lie to your boss, you get a point for sayat. It's very individualized.
Highly individualistic, yeah. But Parwez takes a totally different approach. He looks at the root mechanics of the words. In his analysis, hasanat means perfect structural balance, proportion, equilibrium.
Like an engineering concept.
Exactly like that. Think of it like a beautifully engineered suspension bridge where the tension in every single cable is distributed perfectly, allowing the bridge to carry immense weight without stress.
Okay, I can picture that. So what's sayats then?
Sayat means imbalance, deterioration, systemic rot. It's what happens when the load is distributed unfairly, the cables begin to fray, and the structural integrity of the bridge is compromised.
Okay, so if we map that onto a government trying to eliminate crime, which would be a manifestation of sayat or a systemic rot, the standard societal response is to use the stick.
Always a stick.
Right. If crime goes up, a government builds more prisons, they hire more police, they inflict harsher minimum sentences. The logic is that you can beat the imbalance out of the system by punishing the symptoms.
And Parwez argues that this is a fundamental failure of socioeconomic logic. You cannot punish a system into balance. He outlines a bold mechanism from the text, which is that you do not cure crime by immediately hitting people with punitive force.
He uses a specific example for this, right? The starving thief.
Yes. He uses the example of a starving man who steals a loaf of bread. In a standard punitive system, the state arrests the man, prosecutes him, and locks him in a cage. The state feels it has achieved justice because a law was broken and a punishment was dealt.
But the underlying structural imbalance hasn't been touched at all. I mean, the state completely ignores the starvation that necessitated the theft in the first place.
Exactly. The root cause is just ignored.
I see the logic, but let me challenge the practicality of this for a second. If a guy breaks into a bakery because he's hungry, and the state just hands him a baguette instead of arresting him, aren't you just incentivizing theft?
What?
I mean, the baker who just got his window smashed is going to riot. You know, you can't just excuse the crime because of the hardship or the entire economy breaks down.
Right, but Parwez isn't arguing that you hand the thief a baguette at the scene of the crime and just ignore the broken window.
Yeah.
That's a misunderstanding of the framework.
Okay, clarify that for me.
He is arguing that a rational society must recognize that the theft is a lagging indicator of its own systemic failure. If a man is starving, the state has already failed its primary constitutional duty.
Oh, I see.
The rational cure is not to focus all your resources on the prison system. The cure is to build an economic infrastructure where hunger simply does not exist.
So does that mean punitive laws shouldn't exist at all? Does he advocate for a system where every crime is just blamed on society and no individual is held accountable?
Not at all. That's a really critical distinction to make. Parwez maintains that punitive laws like the police, the courts, the prisons, they are necessary, but they are the absolute last resort. They are reserved strictly for the psychologically incorrigible.
The outliers.
Yeah.
Like the people who, even when they have absolute material security, still choose to exploit or harm others out of malice or greed.
Right. The white-collar criminals, the sociopaths.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the primary driving mechanism for societal order cannot be the threat of punishment. The primary mechanism must be flooding the system with constructive, need-meeting infrastructure. You scale up the hasanat.
You drown out the rot with balance.
Exactly. You build a society so rich in opportunity, so secure in its safety nets, and so balanced in its resource distribution that the rational incentive to commit a crime of desperation simply vanishes. You don't try to scare a starving man into not stealing.
You feed him so the thought never even crosses his mind.
Perfectly said.
It requires a massive shift in how a state allocates its resources, though. Instead of funding the reaction to crime, you fund the eradication of the conditions that breed it.
Yes, which is a huge pivot.
But that requires an incredibly unified, cohesive system. To actually execute that level of economic justice, a government would need a singular vision of resource distribution. And this is where Parwez's critique gets incredibly sharp, I think, because he points out exactly why societies consistently fail to achieve this unified balance.
Yeah, this is where we move into his structural critique of existing belief systems and power structures. If the formula is so clear, Feed people, provide security, achieve balance. Why do so few nations actually pass the boiling water test?
It's a great question.
Parwaz traces this failure directly back to sectarianism and fractured laws. He makes a profound structural claim here, dividing a population into sects, whether that's Sunni, Shia, Hanafi, Barelvi, or even dividing them by rigid nationalistic identities like Pakistani, Iranian, Arab, is functionally shirk.
Wait, shirk. I always thought shirk was strictly defined as polytheism, like worshiping multiple gods or bowing to different statues. How does he connect that to socioeconomic infrastructure and sectarianism?
It's brilliant, honestly. He takes the concept out of the realm of personal theology and places it entirely into the realm of jurisprudence and constitutional law. From a socioeconomic standpoint, what is a god? In this context, it is a center of absolute legislative authority. It is the source of the law. If a nation allows different, quote, personal laws for different sects, meaning every group interprets civil and social law based on their own specific historical scholars, founders, or traditions, you destroy the unified rule of law.
Because you essentially have competing centers of legislative power.
Yeah.
You have multiple gods dictating how society should run.
Exactly. If an action regarding inheritance or marriage or economic welfare is handled one way for Group A but handled entirely differently for Group B, and both groups live in the same society, you no longer have a universal standard of justice. You have systemic fragmentation.
But wait, modern democratic systems often point to that kind of fragmentation as a triumph of tolerance. I mean, the idea that different communities can operate under their own cultural or religious sub-laws is usually praised. People call it multiculturalism or freedom of religion. Why does Parwaz view it as a systemic rot?
Because of the friction it creates. Think back to the bridge analogy we talked about earlier.
Right, the perfectly tensioned suspension bridge.
Yeah. If the engineers building the bridge are all using different systems of measurement, like one group is using the metric system, another is using imperial, and a third is using a system based on ancient texts, the bridge will collapse.
Oh, wow. Yeah, and literally couldn't hold its own weight.
Right. It is structurally impossible to build a unified, balanced socioeconomic system, Hassanat, if the rules of the game change depending on which neighborhood you live in or which historical scholar your family happens to follow.
That makes total sense. Competing centers of legislative power inevitably lead to unequal distribution of resources and unequal application of justice.
Which ultimately leads to systemic rot. So yeah.
So in Parwaz's view, what does it actually mean to be religious or to invite someone to a belief system? He talks about the concept of dawah, which is usually translated as inviting people to God.
Yeah.
But if we are looking at this purely through a constitutional lens, what is he actually inviting them to?
He argues that inviting people to God does not mean pointing to a deity in the sky and asking people to hold a specific belief in their hearts.
Okay.
It means inviting people to submit to a single, unified, unchanging constitutional law. The text itself serves as the unyielding foundation.
Which gives a totally different weight to the phrase, I am a Muslim. I mean, in this framework, when the text instructs a person to declare, I am only a Muslim and nothing else, no prefixes, no suffixes, no sectarian qualifiers, is not just a statement of spiritual identity.
No, it is a legal civic declaration. It is a citizen declaring allegiance to a single, unified rule of law. It is the explicit rejection of sublabels.
Because the moment you say, I am this type of Muslim, or I follow that specific school of thought,
you are essentially telling the state and your neighbors, I am subject to a different set of laws than you are. Parwaz argues that a society fractured by those sublabels can never achieve the socioeconomic equilibrium required to pass the boiling water test.
Okay, so we've established the critique. Parwaz has diagnosed the disease, fragmented laws, competing legislative centers, and punitive systems that ignore the root causes of imbalance. But tearing down the existing structure is the easy part, right? What does a rational alternative actually look like in practice? Does the text offer a historical working model for this?
It does, actually. And Parwaz points to a very specific historical and structural prerequisite mentioned in the text regarding the Quraysh tribe. He argues that this serves as the foundational blueprint for a rationally governed society.
The Quraysh prerequisite. This part of the analysis really caught my attention because it maps out the required sequence of events so clearly.
Yes, the sequence is everything.
Parwaz highlights that before any divine law demanded obedience from the Quraysh, before they were expected to submit to a new system of governance and strict behavioral laws, two fundamental socioeconomic conditions had already been met.
Right. And what were they?
First, they were secured from hunger. The text explicitly notes that their trade routes were safe, their economy was thriving, and they enjoyed material abundance. And second, they were secured from fear. They had profound political and physical security in their region.
Think about the implication of that sequence for a second. Parwez is arguing that a government or any system of authority cannot rationally demand obedience from its citizens. It cannot legitimately enforce its laws or expect compliance unless it has first guaranteed their economic survival and physical safety.
That completely flips the standard social contract on its head. Usually, governments demand obedience first, like pay your taxes, follow the laws, submit to the police force, and in exchange, we will try to create an economy where you can survive.
Try being the operative word there.
Exactly. Parvez is saying the state's right to demand your obedience is strictly conditional. If the state has not provided the bread, it has no rational right to punish the starving thief. The burden of proof is on the system first, the individual second.
It's a radical reimagining of civic accountability. You cannot demand someone respect a system that is actively letting them starve or leaving them terrified of violence. And to prove that this isn't just wishful thinking, Parwez draws a fascinating parallel between social laws and physical, natural laws.
Oh, right. He introduces what we can call the deadland analogy.
Yes. He asks us to picture a patch of earth that is completely dry, cracked, and dead. Nothing grows there. It's barren. Then a heavy rain falls, the water hits the dead earth, and suddenly it comes back to life. Seeds sprout, green shoots appear.
Right. And when we see that happen, we don't look at the sprouting plants and think it's magic. We don't view it as a supernatural miracle. We understand that it is a fundamental law of nature. It is strict, observable cause and effect. Water plus soil equals life.
It's a biological certainty, and Parwez argues that applying universal socio-economic laws will revive a dead, stagnant nation with that exact same mathematical predictability.
So it's not a gamble.
Not at all. If you have a nation that is crippled by poverty, paralyzed by fear, and fractured by sectarian violence, a dead land, and you introduce the reign of absolute economic justice, unified constitutional law, and security from hunger, that nation will revive. It's not a political hope, it's a structural guarantee.
He draws a direct parallel between human societies and planetary orbits, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. The sun and the moon follow strict orbital laws. The physical universe operates on perfect, unyielding balance because those bodies don't have a choice. They follow the laws of physics inherently.
But human societies have free will. We can choose how we organize ourselves.
Exactly. Human beings aren't forced into an orbit. We must consciously choose to adopt these structural, socio-economic laws to achieve the same level of stability that we see in the cosmos.
So it really comes down to human agency.
Yes. If a society chooses to follow the unified blueprint, providing security from hunger and fear before demanding obedience, it gets the stability of the solar system. If it chooses fragmented laws, punitive cruelty, and sectarian division, it gets chaos.
So if it's a choice and the mechanism for balance hasanat is clear, how do we maintain it without overcorrecting? Because earlier we discussed how fixing crime means flooding the system with constructive infrastructure, but we also agreed that there is still a necessary, albeit minimal, place for punitive law for the outliers.
Right, for the incorrigible ones.
Yeah. It seems like the entire system rests on an incredibly fragile sense of proportion. What happens when a society leans too far in one direction?
That brings us to Parwez's highly unique definition of the concept of ilhad. Typically, if you look up ilhad in a theological dictionary, it is translated as atheism or heresy or deviating from the religious path.
But keeping with his empirical structural framework, Parwez defines ilhad purely as loss of precise proportion. It is an imbalance. It is taking something that is necessary and pushing it to an extreme where it becomes destructive to the whole.
He uses three incredibly concrete analogies in the source text to ensure we understand exactly what loss of proportion means in the physical world. The first is the human face.
Oh, I found this one so striking.
Yeah, imagine a face that is aesthetically perfect, universally considered beautiful because all the features are perfectly proportioned. Parwez points out that if you were to take just one eye and shift it by a single millimeter, the beauty is completely destroyed.
Just a millimeter.
Just 1 millimeter. The face becomes distorted and unsettling. The elements are all still there, the eye, the nose, the mouth, but the precise mathematical proportion has been lost. That millimeter shift is ilhad.
Wow. And the second analogy he uses is the wobbly chair, which I think is something literally everyone can relate to.
Oh, definitely.
You can have a chair made of the finest wood, beautifully crafted, incredibly expensive. But if just one of the four legs is cut a fraction of an inch too short, you lose all balance. When you sit in it, you can't relax. Your body is constantly tense, trying to compensate for the imbalance.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
And that constant, low-level tension is exactly what a society feels like when its laws lack proportion. Everyone is stressed, constantly trying to compensate for the structural wobble.
And the third analogy is perhaps the most practical for how a government functions. The doctor's prescription. When a doctor diagnoses an illness, they write a prescription with exact weights and proportions. 3 milligrams of one chemical, 10 milligrams of another.
It has to be exact.
Right. If the pharmacist decides to ignore those proportions and just mixes the ingredients haphazardly, the medicine doesn't just fail to heal you, it becomes a lethal poison. The healing power of the medicine is entirely dependent on respecting the exact proportion.
So if we apply that back to the mechanics of governance, what does extremism look like in Parwez's framework? It's not just about radical political ideologies or violent fringes. Extremism is a loss of proportion in the machinery of justice.
Exactly. If a society leans entirely into punitive justice, if it relies solely on prisons, police, and harsh sentences to maintain order, but it provides zero welfare and zero economic security, that is ilhad.
It's an imbalanced prescription that will poison the society.
The weight of the system is entirely on the stick, and the structure will snap.
Conversely, if a society leans entirely into pure mercy, if it removes all accountability, ignores all destructive behavior, and dismantles the rule of law in the name of boundless compassion and tolerance, that is also ilhad. It destroys the social equilibrium just as thoroughly.
You need both, but in the exact right measure.
Right. You need the immense systemic infrastructure of welfare to cure the root causes of Sayat, but you absolutely need the precise, unyielding application of law for the incorrigible outliers. And it has to be governed by a single, unified constitution free from sectarian fragmentation. True justice requires the precision of the doctor's scale.
It is a stunningly rational vision of society. It strips away all the mystical, emotionally manipulative elements of how authority usually operates. It demands that we stop judging our systems by their intentions or their historical lineage and start judging them by empirical results.
Is the water boiling?
Exactly. Is the water boiling? Are the people fed? Is the law unified? If not, the system is broken and needs to be structurally re-engineered.
It challenges almost every convention of modern political and social discourse. It refuses to accept good intentions as a substitute for tangible socioeconomic balance, which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to explore.
Yeah, let's bring it all together.
We've talked about the wobbly chair, the shifted eye, the precise prescription. We understand that in the physical world, survival and health require exact, measurable precision. If we build a bridge, we use rigorous mathematical engineering, because if we rely on sentiment, the bridge will collapse and people will fall.
So the question for you to walk away with is this. If societal health requires the exact, measurable precision of a doctor's prescription or the strict laws of physics, why do we tolerate modern political and legal systems that operate almost entirely on sentiment, tribalism, and shifting ideologies?
It's wild when you think about it that way.
What would actually happen if we stopped arguing about whose ideological label is superior and began auditing our social structures with the exact same ruthless empirical math that we use to engineer suspension bridges or launch rockets into orbit?
What if we actually demanded that the water boil? That is something worth deeply considering. Keep questioning the structure.